Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are continuing on with our lectures on Unit 6, the consequences of industrialization. We are going to continue looking at new imperialism today. So, what are some of the changes we're seeing in Africa? The title of today's notes is New Imperialism. This lines up with topic 6.4 in our AP course description, looking at global economic development. So you will be able to explain how various environmental factors contributed to the development of the global economy from 1750 to 1900. Okay, let's get started. So we've talked a lot about sort of this new wave of imperialism in general. We've talked about the motivations. We've talked about Britain's actions in India, Europe's actions in Africa. Let's continue talking about the impact of this new wave of imperialism on the world. So we see that it's not just the British who are reaching out their imperial arm. In Central Asia, Russia is going to do that as well. You've heard me say this before, but Russia is just as much of an imperial state as any of our other European states. However, instead of going across an ocean to find new lands to conquer, Russia just went east. So, between 1865 and 1876, Russia was able to use modern weapons to advance into Central Asia. The Kazakh people resisted fiercely, but by the end of the 19th century, they were reduced to starvation, their grazing lands fenced off and turned over to Russian farmers. South of the Kazakh steppe, it was fairly easy for Russian expeditions to take over the oases of Muslim populations in their productive cotton growing land. So Russian rule didn't really benefit the people living here. But frankly, it also brought little change to their life as well. So part of Russian rule in Central Asia included the abolition of slavery, the building of some railroads, increased production of cotton. But the Russians did not try to change the customs, language, or religious beliefs of these new peoples that they conquered in Central Asia. In Southeast Asia and Indonesia, Burma, Malay, Indochina, aka Vietnam, and northern Sumatra, which is one of the Indonesian islands, were conquered in stages between 1850 and the early 1900s. Only Siam remained independent. So all of these areas had really fertile soil, a favorable climate, and highly developed agricultural systems in place. The colonial regimes would use Chinese and Indian laborers and introduce new crops to these regions. They increased the agricultural production and provided peace and a reliable food supply that really will fuel a rapid population increase in Southeast Asia. Colonialism will contribute to the expansion of the agricultural population and immigration from India and China. We also see the spread of Islam as well. European education will eventually lead to the development of nationalism in these regions as well. Again, you have to remember that these places didn't consider themselves nation states, right? This is a very European idea. And so there was no rallying around, we are citizens of this island, thus we should fight back. It was your allegiance would be to your tribe, to your ethnic group. But as the Europeans imposed their political systems on these regions, that includes the idea of a nation state and thus the idea of nationalism as well. Most of Southeast Asia was comprised of small independent kingdoms that were easily conquered. the French in Indochina, aka Vietnam, will try to apply their ideals, but it's not really going to work. It's going to create lots of really negative feelings, a really negative relationship between French imperialism and the culture infiltrating Vietnam. The Dutch will take over essentially Indonesia, and they'll do it brutally, just with extreme violence, really a genocide on many of those islands. And Siam, which I mentioned before, which remained independent, that's modern day Thailand, and they're the only one who did not succumb to imperial powers. Many of our Pacific Islanders will have remained in isolation for thousands of years, and thus have their own sophisticated cultures and societies, right? It's incorrect to assume that a non-industrial society is somehow a non-sophisticated society. But these societies on Pacific Islands did not have the same immunities to diseases because of their isolation. And they are going to be very vulnerable to the arrival of Europeans and to their weapons. It will really lead to social disintegration and suffering on many of these islands. So, one last thing about Indonesia, the Dutch East Indias. Remember, we talked about the Srivijaya kingdom that had begun in the 6th century. Well, they had controlled the Strait of Malacca, and by the 15th century, the last Srivijayan king had converted to Islam. In the 16th century, the Dutch paid tribute to the local sultans to create good trade relations. Their goal is to have a monopoly over the spice trade. But they will use their ability to move, their weaponry, and manipulation of the political conflict that already existed. So they'll take advantage of the internal political conflict within Indonesia and use it to their advantage to ultimately take control. So by 1750, they controlled most of the Javanese kingdoms, and they used the cultivation system, which is a Dutch policy that required peasants plant a fifth of their land with export crops, which had to be turned over to the Dutch in taxes. What about the United States? Well, the U.S. is an imperial state as well, even if we arrived to it late in the game, right? We were a colony in that first wave of imperialism, and now in the second wave, we have imperial ambitions as well. So you see economic imperialism in Hawaii, and the goal with economic imperialism is the exertion of economic influence rather than political control. So English Captain James Cook first arrived in Hawaii in the late 1700s. The arrival of Europeans brought STDs and tuberculosis, which will really devastate the native population. About 50% of the native Hawaiians will die. American companies will arrive and begin to set up plantations to grow and export pineapples and sugar, and they will encourage the immigration of Japanese and Chinese workers as well. After 1872, with the decline of the Hawaiian monarchs, Hawaii will be annexed by the United States. So, we are an industrial state by 1900. That means, like our other industrial states, we are in search of new raw materials and new markets. One of the ways that we do that is by getting in a fight with Spain. So we participate in the Spanish-American War, which is really us picking a fight. You'll learn all about it in A-Push next year, but it's definitely a war partially motivated, if not majority motivated, by the media, yellow journalism. When Spain loses, they are going to give up to us Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. So in the Philippines, you will see that there's already been some unrest. Emilio Aguinaldo had led an uprising against the Spanish in 1898, and he very well might have succeeded in establishing a republic if it didn't have anything to do with the fact that the United States took over the Philippines. So Aguinaldo didn't want to exchange one colonial ruler for another, so he's going to rise up against the United States as well. Well, the U.S. will really suppress the insurrection. The U.S. Army will torture prisoners, burn villages and crops, forced inhabitants into reconcentration camps, and over 200,000 Filipinos will die. Then the U.S. will really try to soften its rule by introducing public works and economic development projects. So, think back to when we first introduced new imperialism. What are our white dominion colonies? What are tropical colonies? What is economic imperialism, and what is an example? Okay, let's talk about Latin America. So, remember, in Latin America, we said in many ways it's as if the Confederates won the war, right? It's the people who don't want change were the ones who led the independence movements. They want to preserve their wealth, and they're not interested in really encouraging a nation, a national economy. So, right, these caudillos, these oligarchs. So with that means they're going to sell off a lot of the resources of their Latin American countries. So you see free trade imperialism really taking hold in Latin America. So free trade imperialism is economic dominance of a weaker country by a more powerful one, while maintaining the legal independence of the weaker state. Right? This should sound familiar to you who took AP Human Geography last year with Wallerstein's world systems theory. Latin America will not be recolonized. However, the economic relationship that they find themselves in is really not that different from that of the colonies. The natural resources of Latin American republics made them targets for economic dependence and free trade imperialism. British and U.S. entrepreneurs will really finance and construct railroads in Latin America to exploit the agricultural and mineral wealth. Not there yet. Latin American elites will really encourage foreign companies to do this with generous concessions because it appeared to be the fastest way to modernize their countries and enrich themselves. What about Cuba? So, like I said, we're going to sort of get Cuba in at the end of the Spanish-American War. The Cubans will rebel against Spanish rule in 1895. They were still technically a colony. And U.S. businessmen will be really concerned about their Cuban investments in sugar and tobacco plantations. So the U.S. government sends the USS Maine, a Navy ship, to Havana Harbor, and it blows up while in the harbor. And we say, oh my gosh, it was the Spanish, they blew it up. Probably not. It was probably a boiler exploded. No malfeasance. But it allows us to go to war. The result is going to be the Spanish give up Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S. The U.S. buys the Philippines, and it allows for direct U.S. involvement in the Caribbean. Cuba technically becomes an independent republic, but very subject to manipulation by the U.S. So we're going to start to see a pattern emerging where the United States will often use military interventions to force small nations in Central America and the Caribbean to repay loans, to make sure that the actions of those small countries would not, sorry, baby. The actions of the governments in those small countries would not somehow negatively impact the U.S. economic interests of the businesses that are located there. So that means the U.S. will occupy Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Haiti at various occasions during the late 19th and early 20th century. We'll talk about the role we play in overthrowing democratically elected governments in Latin America in the 20th century later. The U.S. was particularly forceful in Panama. So the Panamanians are part of Colombia, technically. Well, they desire some independence, and the U.S. says, hey, yeah, we'll help you get independence if you let us build a canal, and we are going to own the canal. So it works. Panamanian independence is 1903, and then we end up building and controlling the Panama Canal. So, in general, we're seeing a much more globalized economy, right? You see this really expansion from mercantilist economies, from domestic cottage industries, to really a global industrial economic system. So the Industrial Revolution really increased the demand for spices, silk, agricultural goods, and raw materials in industrialized countries. The growing need for these products could not be met by the traditional methods of production and transportation. So the imperialists brought their colonies into the mainstream of the world market and introduced new technologies. The greatest change for all of this is going to be transportation. Canals, steamships, harbor improvements, railroads all cut travel time and lowered freight costs. But once again, in some ways, we still have a continuity, whether it's new imperialism, old imperialism, or feudalism, right? Economic prosperity is based on non-free labor in one way or another. What about the environment? Well, of course, this new economic system and this demand for raw materials will have a huge impact on the natural environment. These economic changes brought about by Europeans and Americans will alter the environments around the world. Forests will be cut down to grow tea plantations. Plant species will be identified and classified, right? This is like the golden age of botany. Commercially valuable plants will be transported from one tropical region to another, thus introducing invasive species, animals, plant life. The expansion of permanent agriculture and the increased use of irrigation and water control will lead to increased agricultural production in both well-watered and dry areas of the tropics. This agricultural development will support large populations, but it will also put more pressure on the land. And then, of course, you have railroads, right? Railroads will consume vast amounts of land, timber, iron, and coal, but it also opens up previously remote land to development. The demand for gold, iron, and other minerals will really fuel a mining boom that will bring toxic runoff from open mines and slag heaps. You will see this in Appalachia, you see this in Latin America, you see this in the American Southwest here in Arizona. So, sort of main points from this section. Imperial powers are going to be motivated by political, religious, economic, and social pressures, right? The scramble for Africa will be carried out differently depending on the area and the colonizing power, but all Africans were changed by the effects. Russia and the U.S. became involved in colonization in Asia, and the U.S. also took part in political events in Latin America in order to protect its own interests. And imperialism brought heavy European investment of technology, transportation, and urbanization, while at the same time threatening native environments. Okay, let's do some practice questions. What were the primary results of the Spanish-American War? When confronted with the choice of economic growth or environmental protection in the 1800s and early 1900s, perhaps the most critical feature to economic integration was which form of technology in the Western Hemisphere. So, for your summary, I'd like you to explain how various environmental factors contributed to the development of a global economy and how various economic factors contributed to the development of migration. If you have any questions, please ask. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.